Good morning, everyone. I'm Catherine Berkman, Associate Director, Knowledge Transfer and Exchange. And on behalf of Dr. Jack Callahan, Director of the Center of Research Expertise for the Prevention of Musculoskeletal Disorders, or CRE-MSD as we are more commonly known, we'd like to thank you for joining us today for this free webinar on the S word, Standards, the Road into Industry and Practice. This webinar is co-hosted with the International Ergonomics Association, IEA, Technical Committee on Musculoskeletal Disorders. It is my pleasure to welcome our co-facilitator, Zuzu, the IEA MSD Technical Committee Chair, who will be introducing you to our speaker today. First, a few administrative details. We are grateful to the Ministry of Labor, Immigration, Training, and Skills Development for our funding, which supports the delivery of these webinars, and to our presenters who provide their expertise. This webinar will be recorded, with the recording being made available to you, along with the presenter's slides shortly after today's webinar. Please note, participant names will not be visible in the recording of the webinar. The format of today's webinar is as follows. The presentation will be given, after which time we will have 10 to 15 minutes for a question and answer period with our presenter. Please refrain from using the raise hand button, as we will not be monitoring this feature or any other meeting reactions. During the question and answer period, we ask that you type your questions into the chat. The chat feature can be pulled up on the bottom of your screen by selecting the chat icon in the control panel that appears near the bottom of your screen. I will relay these questions to the presenter or a similar question should we have duplicate themes. Your video is disabled and you will be muted for the entire presentation to ensure there's no background noise. Should you have a pressing question or issue such as a technology glitch, which cannot wait until the end of the presentation, please type this in our chat and we will do our best to address it right away. After the webinar, you will be sent a link to an evaluation. Please fill this out, as it will assist us in the future delivery of our webinars. Thank you so much for joining us today. And if you have not already, please check out our MSD Prevention Guideline for Ontario website at msdprevention.com. And we hope to see you again at our next webinar on May the 28th for vibration exposures in arborists. Do cut types and directions make a difference for MSD prevention? Now it is my pleasure to introduce Zuzu, the IEA MSD Technical Committee Chair, to present to you Mr. Robert Fox.
Thank you, Catherine. Hello, everyone. My name is Zhu. I am from North Carolina State University, Industrial and System Engineering Department. So this year, me and Dr. Speckle from RB Uno Amsterdam, we are hosting a series of webinars on behalf of the IEA MSD Technical Committee. And for today, it is our great pleasure to be able to co-host this webinar with CRE-MSD. And it is also our great honor to be able to have Dr. Bob Fox to be here to present this great speech. So Dr. Fox has over 40 years of experience in the field of ergonomics, human factors, and physical anthropology. He was the occupational ergonomics subject matter expert in General Motors, North America, and the global ergonomics activities from 1993 until May of 2022, and is both a Human Factor Ergonomics Society and International Ergonomics Association Fellow. So HFES Fellow and IEA Fellow. While at GM, he supported all aspects of ergonomics in manufacturing operations. He also chairs the HFES Technical Standard Division and formerly chairs the U.S. Technical Advisory Group to the International Standard Organization, ISO, for anthropometry and biomechanics, and participates in various work groups for the American National Standard Institute, ANSI, and ISO ergonomics standards and reports. He also participates in the National Occupational Research Agenda, NORA, cross-sector councils for both MSDs and healthy work design, and is a full member of American Conference of Governmental Industrial Hygienists, ACGIH, Physical Agents Committee. He has also journal papers on manual material handlings. the revised Nash Institute for Occupational Safety and Health Defining Equations, the Nash Defining Equation, work-related musculoskeletal disorders and ergonomics and aging. He's currently a lecturer at the Department of Industrial and Operations Engineering department at the University of Michigan, and also lectures in the continuing education program of UC Berkeley's Center for Occupational and Environmental Health. So thank you very much for Dr. Bob Fox to be here today. And now it is over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Zhu, for the very generous introduction. We'll welcome everyone to the webinar today. I'd like to be talking about standards, MSD related standards. If I can, okay, advance my slides now. First of all, for the topics, I'd like to talk a little bit about terminology and acronyms that we find in the standards world. I'd like to discuss what do standards mean and how are they used, and I'll kind of come back to that discussion throughout the presentation. I'll talk about ISO standards updates, organization revisions updates, new projects, especially as related to MSDs. I'll probably be focusing a bit more on ISO standards. We'll talk also a little bit about ANSI and HFES standards, an ACGIH Physical Agents Committee, the ergonomics, the TLVs, and other standards. We'll take a brief look at those. We'll talk about the impact of standards and also lessons learned about standards. When I was first invited to do this, I was first thinking in terms of, well, okay, I'll give you an overview of standards and all, but then I thought I'd do a deeper dive on that and talk about some of the issues with standards and the lessons learned in my about 25 years of standards work. So first of all, let's start out with some terminology and acronyms. And I can think in the past when I've developed a list of acronyms to explain, what they were, and then I ended up giving that list an acronym. But let's start off with ISO. ISO is the International Standards Organization. Now, TC is a technical committee, and ISO has over 300 of them. And the Ergonomics Technical Committee is TC 159. And those technical committees cover just about everything you can think of, from machine safety to flooring materials to nanotechnology to traditional Chinese medicine. Under the technical committee are the subcommittees. Now, each participant nation has a mirror committee, subcommittee and working groups. There may be several different subcommittees, and I'll show you what we have under TC 159. And then there are working groups, and they are under a subcommittee. There may be a number of working groups that work on different standards projects, and also each nation has tags for each subcommittee, which is a technical advisory group. Now, ISO project designations, you'll see a few of these as I go through the presentation. There's NP, which is a new project, something that's just been introduced and a writing group has been formed to work on it. There's a CD, which is a committee draft, and that's a committee draft of a particular standards project. There is a DIS, which is a draft international standard, an FDIS, which is a final draft international standard, and a TR, which is a technical report. Now, ISO, as do most standards producing organizations, they have kind of a timeline and time frame that they go through that allows time for the development of these different projects and then for their review and their balloting. Some other terminology: CSA is the Canadian Standards Association, the CSA group. ANSI, the American National Standards Institute, and ACGIH, the American Conference of Governmental Industrial Hygienists. CEN, which is the Committee for European Normalization of the European Union. ASTM is the American Society for Testing and Materials, and SAE is the Society of Automotive Engineers. Now, we'll touch on each of these. And I do need to note that for a number of these organizations, they tend to go by their acronym as opposed to their full name. So, understanding what standards mean and how they are used. And here's some questions that I'm going to pose that hopefully we'll kind of answer as we go through this. Who is the intended user of a standard? When a standard is out there, is it designers, engineers, practitioners? Some standards, for example, if we look at the, which I'll be talking about, the ISO SC3 standards, which are oriented towards practitioners, where we look at the equivalent standards, let's say in the machinery directive of CEN, they're oriented towards machine designers. So there can be some differences there. Also, are the standards technical or are they programmatic? And we'll see some examples of some that are both. Most of the standards that I've worked on are really technical, and they may have suggestions, program suggestions for how that standard should be used. Then also who adopts a standard. And we'll look at this too. It could be governments, industries, trade and professional organizations, etc. And then also, are they enforceable? And we'll be talking about that. Now, who produces them? Are they international? Are they produced by an industry or professional group or by an expert group? And there are differences. And also, are they subject to public review and comment? Now, most of the standards are to some degree subject to a period of public review and comment. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And then the differences when we talk about, well, best practices versus guidelines versus standards versus regulations. What are really the difference? Regulations are generally enforceable by a governmental agency. They're generally law. They've been adopted by a legislature or some other government body, and non-compliance can result in penalties. Standards may or may not be enforceable depending upon who adopts them. They may be the basis for regulations, or they may be just used for guidelines. And then best practices and guidelines may be published by different professional and industrial groups, and I've had a lot of involvement in that as well, may have varying degrees of rigor in their development. They're usually not enforced, although they can be written into labor agreements, but there is an expectation of compliance. So looking at ISO, I mentioned ISO TC 159 for ergonomics. And here's a description of the scope, which I'm going to go through very briefly. The standardization in the field of ergonomics, human factors in particular, general ergonomics principles, anthropometry and biomechanics, ergonomics of human system interaction, and ergonomics of the physical environment, addressing human characteristics and performance, and methods for specifying, designing, and evaluating products, systems, services, environments, and facilities. So that is the kind of the ISO technical committee. And they've been considering adding psychosocial issues to the scope as well, and we'll see where that goes. Now, the Human Factors and Ergonomic Society in the United States administers the ISO TC 159 tags. So ANSI is really the standards agency in the United States, and they've delegated that to the Human Factors and Ergonomic Society. Now this org chart here is a little bit out of date, but you can kind of see the structure of it. Now each nation that is involved in, let's say, TC 159 standards probably has a similar organizational chart. So we have the SC1 Subcommittee 1 tag the technical advisory group, general ergonomics principles. The SC3 tag, that's the one I've been most involved in, which is anthropometry and biomechanics. The SC4 tag, ergonomics of human system interaction, and the SC5 tag, ergonomics of the physical environment. And you can see under each of them, there are a number of working groups. And notice they're not all strictly numerical. There have been some working groups in the past that have been that reached the end of whatever their charter was and ended up being dissolved. And so we have some things out of order, like we don't have an SC2, for example. But you can kind of see there what some of the different categories are, what some of the different subject matters are. Now, some of the current ISO TC 159 SC3 and Working Group 4, the MSD related standards and technical reports. Now, this is a list. These are probably the primary ones. And notice there's a 11.228 series. If we take a look there, the 11.226 and the 228 parts 1, 2, and 3. And if you look at what they're involved in is manual handling. Part 1 was lifting, lowering, and carrying. Part 2, pushing and pulling. And Part 3, handling of low loads at high frequency. It's in revision, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. The Part 2 is also in revision. And then notice there are also a number of technical reports, application documents, which is guidance for how to apply the standard. One for applying those standards to agricultural and construction centers, and another one which gives additional information on applying the 11.228 series overall. So it was these standards, this 11.228 series, that first got me involved in standards work about 2001, 2002. So, and the interesting thing about these standards, this family of standards, they were fast-tracked from SEN standards from the machinery directive into ISO. So they needed probably a lot of work to make them truly a global standard. So let's take a look at some other things related to it. There was a controversy back in 2019 over these ISO standards being adopted as health regulations. There was a discussion paper in the Scandinavian Journal of Work and Environmental Health about the scientific basis of ISO standards on biomechanical risk factors, and it was rather critical of the ISO process as they saw at that time, and that had a number of heavy hitters that authored that article. Thomas Armstrong, Jim Potvin, David Rempel, Bill Maris, and all, and they made a number of issues and allegations, and they were correct. They talked about the lack of evidence-based reviews and involvement of a broad base of stakeholders and researchers globally for these health-based standards, a lack of transparency, and the possibility of conflict of interest. Now, at that time, I remember at the IEA Congress in 2018, I was asked specifically to talk about this, and it was at the IEA, the Technical Committee on MSDs. And for some reason, for a number of different reasons, I think also I was the chair of the Technical Standards Division at the time, it kind of fell down to me to do something about it. So my response was to increased emphasis on evidence-based reviews for standards and their revisions, and a critical review of the content of standards to make sure that the research reflected in the standard is current, and include researchers, stakeholders for updates and revisions. So a lot of reaching out and engaging others. And I'll talk more about that later. And also to work within the ISO process and the Vienna Agreement. And so far that seems to have paid off. So let's look at the status of some ISO revisions. First one I want to talk about is the ISO 11228 whole body push and pull standard, its revision. Now first, some background on the interest in whole body push pull. Being in industry, as I was, going back into the 1990s, and the introduction of lean systems and Kanban and just-in-time philosophies and things like that. What the impact on industry was on manufacturing industries is to reduce the amount of material in in-process inventories. That rather than having fork trucks deliver like large containers of parts, they had like tuggers and trailers and workers delivering small amounts of material throughout the day to the line station. So you had fewer material tied up and in-process inventory. You had the line side footprint smaller because you only had enough material for, let's say, 1, 2, 3 hours or whatever. But one outcome of that was it reintroduced a manual element into material handling that had been mechanized. Now, also, a lot of materials, larger materials, and scheduled material were delivered on dollies and carts. They would be manually pushed and pulled into place. They could be tugged by tuggers throughout the plant and exchanged line side. Again, to avoid large racks and large amounts of material line side. So there was an emphasis then on material handling and on whole body push pull. So that's why we've got so much interest in whole body push pull in industry, caster manufacturers, dolly and cart manufacturers, etc. Now this standard has been under revision since last year and has suffered some delays. The original version as it came out in 2007 had two methods to it. There was a method 1, which largely I wrote, that was based on the psychophysical Mittal-Nicholson AU push-pull tables for 90% female accommodation. And then method 2 was based upon a biomechanical model that was developed by Karl-Heinz Schaub, who tragically passed away a few years ago. He was one of Germany's leading ergonomists. And it was rarely, if ever, used because you needed certain data for it, and it was rather long. Now, the revision so far, and it's still in the process of revision, will retain that method 1, the psychophysical, and the method 2, biomechanical. And that biomechanical method has been significantly revised by Matthias Jaeger and made simpler to use. Now, Matthias Jaeger is a retired professor. He did a lot of biomechanics work. with the Craft Atlas, the Strength Atlas, and the other publications from Germany. So the model involves both push and pull strength limits for males and females based on spinal shear and compressive force. And the data are compiled in tables, and there are the calculation of limiting safe limits. And annexes will address measurement methods, measurement instrumentation. You know, how do you take a measurement? That's always of a lot of concern. Handheld gauges under industrial conditions, subjective assessments such as the Borg scale, and multiple task assessment. Now, I kind of see some issues with length. I think that this, once it is published, will be a very good reference. Although it's very long, it's not really very concise. And the writing group is working on a draft that should go to the draft international standard stage later this year. There have been a few delays with it. Now, the ISO 11228 Part 3, the repetitive movements and exertions of the upper limbs. Now, we were able to get a name change from handling of low loads at high frequency. We were able to change that because nobody really understood it. And this is what I've been working on. Revision writing group was established in late 2021, and I was asked to lead the revision. I had also led the revision for the part 1 on lifting, lowering, and carrying. And it was agreed that the standard would be significantly revised with the removal of OCRA, the occupational risk assessment, developed in Italy as a preferred method. And that was some of the heartburn that the authors of that article had with this particular standard is as originally written, it was just OCRA, and others were mentioned. So we decided to very much restructure that standard. Now, there's an updated list of MSD assessment methods and tools will be at the core of the standard. It's an updated list, a non-exhaustive list. And there were some delays last year due to some disagreements over the structure of the standard, where they just couldn't come to agreement. So I kind of called a pause to it and talked to ISO and a few other things. So concept draft was reviewed in the late fall of 2023 and comments received, which were reviewed and incorporated into changes. And this is something we were working on for months. And an explanatory table will be provided that will list and describe the various upper extremity risk assessment methods, references, and sources of information. So it's not just one method, it'll be multiple ones. We also defined selection criteria for all the methods selected to be included into the standard, and also special criteria for those deemed risk assessment tools. Now, this is the basic inclusion criteria that we kind of came up with, and that all the tools that we were going to list would meet these criteria. And also, if someone else who's reading or consulting the standard wants to use something else, they can use this inclusion criteria to select their own tool. The idea being is that the tool should be used or can be used with relatively simple equipment, with some basic training, et cetera, and it considers the relevant risk factors for upper limb work-related musculoskeletal disorders. Now, also something else we did with this, the methods were classified as to their predictive or concurrent validity. So the validation research was examined for all of those included methods. And the intent was to provide the potential users of the standard with information on which methods are truly predictive of MSDs. And the other methods are presented as well as useful job design tools. So we don't want to rule those out. It all depends on the needs of the user of the standard. Now, balloting on the DIS stage, the Draft International Standard stage, was just completed, and review of the comments received will start shortly. As a matter of fact, I have a 3-hour meeting tomorrow morning to start to review those comments. So some new standards projects in process. There is a new project on building a muscular strength database, and that proposal has been approved. It'll involve a series of standards for the definition and measurement of strength data that parallel the ISO 7250 series on anthropometry. Now, the 7250 series was started probably about 15 years ago, and it spelled out, first of all, a number of basic anthropometric measurements for the design of facilities, equipment, etc., how they were to be measured, And then in various countries, they would use those criteria to collect anthropometric data, which were then compiled in reports. So we want to do the same thing for muscular strength. So it'll be updated, it will be global. It will include terminology, equipment, and methods for strength measurement to start out with. Again, the intent is to build a global database of standardized strength measurements for design purposes and for use in ergonomics assessment tools. And of course, it'll be a multi-year project. And there is a systematic review of the ISO 11226-2000, which is evaluation of static working postures. There's a draft in the works right now, and it'll be significantly different from the original one from 2000, which is 25 years old. And as I said, the writing group has a draft with extensive changes. Now, some updated standards projects and process, just to let you know about some anthropometric standards, which have been updated in the last year. There has been, over the years, traditionally anthropometric data was recorded with tape measures and calipers, and we see more and more where anthropometric data is collected with 3D scanning. So a number of standards address that, the calibration of these systems and how the data are processed. Also a lot on general requirements for establishing anthropometric databases, etc. Also, there is a new ISO working group under Subcommittee 3, a resolution which was approved actually not too long ago, creating a working group 6 on exoskeletons. And this came out of a project of AFNOR in France, the French Standards Institute, and they had their first meeting, I think, 2 weeks ago on exoskeleton standards. And we have a representation in this committee in the United States, people who are also involved in the ASTM standards on exoskeletons. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Now, a little bit with the ANSI HFES standards briefly. There's the ANSI HFES 100, which is human factors engineering of computer workstations. Now, there were some numerous problems with timing delays and complaints and appeals, and the committee leadership was changed. And they essentially had to kind of start all over. It had been administratively withdrawn by ANSI due to the failure to complete the revision in a 10-year period. So the revision has started over with a new Canvas committee. And then there's the ANSI HFES 400, which is a human readiness level scale, the HRLs. This defines 9 levels of human readiness. The scale provides guidance for their application in the context of systems engineering, human systems integration process. Essentially, the HRL scale says if you're introducing new technology, are your human resources prepared to accept and deal with that technology? So this was started in late 2019. The standard was published in 2021. It's had a lot of acceptance, particularly in the United States with the DoD, the Department of Defense, and military contractors. And it was really, its creation was a model of how the ANSI process is supposed to work. Now, some other ANSI standards and technical reports. I just want to mention these very briefly. I had some input into them. It's been a few years though. The ANSI B56 Committee on Industrial Mobile Equipment. Now, we began to write when General Motors, back prior to 2008, was active on ANSI B56. We wrote some provisions into their standards on compartment ergonomics. We addressed driving backwards, the issues with that, and also whole body vibration. And then there was an ANSI B11 on machine safety, a TIARA technical report, and ergonomics guidelines for the design, installation, and use of machine tools. That was last updated in 2016, and I don't really know what the status of that is right now, but we had information related to material handling, safe material handling, workplace design, etc. In that technical report. Now let's take a look at the ACGIH TLVs and the Physical Agents Committee. And ACGIH is a charitable scientific organization that advances occupational and environmental health. Now they recommend TLVs, threshold limit values, and BEIs, biological exposure indices. And the TLVs are based on the best published data not consensus. I'll talk a little bit more about that later, and they're generally reviewed annually. So some of the current ACGIH ergonomics TLVs, there's the hand activity TLV, the HAL, which was updated in 2018, and actually we're working on a revision of it right now. There's a lifting TLV from 2005, a hand arm vibration, 2019, upper limb localized fatigue, 2016. Now that incorporates the well, a little bit different, the MAE that Dr. Jim Potvin developed, and then whole body vibration, published in 2020 with a new user guide that just came out last year. Now, some of the TLVs in process. There's a whole body push-pull TLV. This is something we've been working on now for a few years. We completed the documentation and literature review back in 2023, and the user guide was completed, a draft of it, in late 2023. It's based on the Ohio State University work by Weston and Maris, and it's been adopted by the Ohio Bureau of Workers' Compensation and addresses two-handed push-pull, one-handed push-pull, and turning. So it'll be published as a notice to establish in the 2025. So there is a user guide for it. And there's an above shoulder work TLV published as a notice to establish in the 2023 TLVs and BEI's booklet. Final vote on adopting it is pending, and it's based upon work by David Rempel and Jim Potvin. And the hand activity TLV. We're currently working on the user guide, and revisions to the documentation is in process, hopefully to make it a bit easier to use. And the Physical Agents Committee wants user guides to be developed for all TLVs. So those user guides are essentially details on how you apply the TLV, how you apply it, how you take measurements, how you interpret it, etc., along with examples. So some other standards. Let's take a brief look. SEN standards, the Committee for European Normalization. They have decided, now there's a lot that we could say, there's a lot of standards that they generate and that they also adopt. And what I wanted to mention here is they've decided to support the merging of the EN 1005 series of standards and machinery directive with the ISO 11228 series of standards. There will be a timeline for that. They've been talking about it for years and not a whole lot has been done. Also, they're moving from the machinery directive to a machinery regulation, and that will be more stringent. So ergonomic standards that are harmonized with the regulation will be included. I also want to mention that there was a European project, SOFIA it was called, and they approached the CEN TC 122 and also the ISO TC 159, the subcommittee 3, to start a CEN workshop agreement to assist with the creation of a guideline document on real-time instrumentation of biomechanical risk assessment. So that was completed in 2024. Now ASTM, there was a memorandum of understanding signed with HFES for collaboration on standards, and the committee F48 is on exoskeletons and exosuits, and they've been meeting now for a number of years, particularly committees F4802 and 03 on human factors and ergonomics and on task performance and environmental considerations. And again, we're trying to set up crosstalk between the ISO efforts on exoskeletons and the F48 so that they're not at odds with each other. Now, I do want to mention that exoskeletons have been around for a long time, going back into the 1950s. Now, these are some excerpts from a Popular Science of November 1965, talking about, at the time, man amplifiers. And at that time, particularly in the military sphere and construction, they saw the man amplifier exoskeleton type designs. Now, none of those really came to fruition. Now, this is something I've been looking at historically, and some of the interest with man amplifiers with exoskeletons goes back into the 1950s, particularly when there were designs, concept designs for nuclear engines for aircraft and rockets. The idea would be to have someone in a protective suit and an exoskeleton that could swap out the components, handle the components. Another interesting thing, if you're interested in exoskeletons, the first book treatment that I've seen of exoskeletons actually goes back to 1971. It was a book entitled Human Factors Applications and Teleoperator Design and Operation. And it first started to talk about exoskeletons. Now, the Society of Automotive Engineers, they've developed over 42,000 standards in the automotive and aviation realm, commercial vehicle industries, etc. There's a memorandum of cooperation that was recently signed between SAE, their G45 group, and HFES. And what G45 is, it's very comparable to the ISO TC 159SC4, and its focus is on human system interaction. So the goal there is to foster cooperation and sharing expert reviewers on projects between SAE and ISO. I also wanted to mention the Canadian Workplace Ergonomics Standard, the Z1004, which I feel is an outstanding standard. Back in 2012, I had some input to it. It discusses the planning and implementation of an ergonomics program. It has a plan, check, do, act approach. It references other standards, provides extensive information and annexes on checklists, assessment methods, etc. And this is a very good example of what would be both programmatic as well as technical aspects. A lot of technical information is provided in the annexes. And it had an outstanding and diverse group of experts who developed it. There was Richard Wells, to name a few, out of University of Waterloo. There was Karen Clark of the CAW, now Unifor, and then Linda Segmeister, who works in Canadian standards. And Linda is one of the best standards people in the world, in my opinion. I've been working with her since 2016. We collaborate a lot on different standards projects. And also I want to mention the Z1003. This is another standard that I really like, the psychological health and safety in the workplace, because this addresses more the psychosocial issues. And again, it looks at both programmatic and technical aspects. And this was also recently updated in 2022. And I've got some information there on the purpose of it. Also, it goes from vision, key drivers, strategic pillars, to the 13 workplace factors and all aspects of implementation. So it's a very, very comprehensive standard. If we look at other psychosocial related type standards and publications, this, in my opinion, does the best job of tying them all together. Now, other potential standards that HFES is considering. There are other memoranda of understanding with others. There's talk of something on cardiotelemetry, validation of AI-human interaction, and human barrier design and life cycle, cognitive safeguards and critical control systems. So let's go back to some of the questions that I raised earlier as far as questions a potential user should ask about a standard. Who's the intended user audience for the standard? That should be apparent. What is the nature of the developer? You know, are they a group of experts? Are they consensus standards makers? Whatever. Was there a process of peer and or public review? And who was or could be involved in the review? And is there a process for the standard to be regularly reviewed and updated? And is that process followed? In other words, the life cycle of the standard. Now, the impact of standards. The impact of a standard may be substantial, but it really depends on who uses and adopts it. And I'd have to say most often standards are used as guidelines. Now, regulations generally have the most impact, because that is in the realm where somebody says, okay, you have to do this, you have to do this, you have to use this standard. And the more usefulness that potential users see in a standard, the more likely it will be widely used. And I think that's a very important point. You can have a very good standard, but if it's awkward and clumsy and hard to use, people are probably not going to use it if they have a choice. Also, in the age of the global economy, standards are more likely to impact businesses who may not directly adopt them. Now, this is something with some of the companies that said, well, we're not going to adopt that standard here, so we really don't care. Well, if we have global operations, they may adopt it in Europe or South America or Asia, and so you're going to have to deal with it. So if you do business in another country that has adopted a standard, you need to know something about it. Now, I'd like to go through just some personal lessons learned from standards work. And again, this is from 20 some years of working in this area. First of all, check the egos and the attitudes at the door. Nobody knows everything, but everybody has something to bring to the table. and be evidence-driven. Ask questions, avoid not invented here syndrome and groupthink, and realize that people can disagree about evidence. Involve others outside of the standards group. So stakeholders. Make sure that stakeholders have a voice in the standards. The better that is, the more likely the standard will be accepted and used. Talk to people who disagree with you. Find out what they disagree about. Work it out, address it. Some compromise is inevitable, especially with consensus standards. There ends up being some degree of compromise with it, and you just have to make sure that compromise enhances the standard and doesn't detract from it. And it's always easier to critique than it is to create. It's always a hard job to start out and create something. And pay particular attention to the review process. Now, one thing, most standards creating organizations have a provision for a systematic review every 5 years or every so many years, whatever. And in some cases, that tends to be very perfunctory. Like a standard may come up, you may have, for example, in some of the ISO standards, you may have a very large committee, you may have a much smaller group of people who are actually active with the standards. And when a standard comes up for review, it's very easy to say, oh, okay, yeah, accept it, no changes, when in fact it may need changes. So that's something we've been paying a lot of attention to. That they, the ballot may say that most of the member nations, are okay with going forward with it, but no, there's some of us that see the need to revise that particular standard. And always keep in mind the eventual user of the standards. Always keep them in mind. Are they going to be able to play devil's advocate with it? Because there have been times before, I think we had very good standards, but we forgot about what the eventual user needed with it. Now, my personal goals for standards work is to continue to publicize and disseminate information on standards, their creators, and uses, and get other people involved. Push for more practitioner and academic participation in standards work. Getting the word out there like what I'm doing right now. Hopefully building some interest in standards and the standards process, and for people who would like to participate in standards. Broaden stakeholder involvement, and I think that's a very, very important aspect, and that kind of ties everything together, and that was one of the criticisms in that 2018 letter. Other goals to continue to build engagement and communication between standards making bodies. Now, this is something so that we're not at odds with each other. Now, in HFES, there's a technical standards committee that I've recently resurrected, and it helps to coordinate crosstalk between standards organizations and allows a greater and more diverse field of potential reviewers and SMEs. So we can share in that committee what we're working on. If there's some issues between standards making organizations, we can deal with it then and there. And also, I want to involve parties in standards work who to date have not been particularly active, and I'm talking about North America, namely labor unions. Now, the HFES Executive Council has said we need to do more outreach to labor unions. We need to kind of engage them and at least inform them about what we are doing in standards. And that hasn't really been the case, at least with many of the industrial unions. They may be involved in certain aspects of standards and regulations, but we haven't seen a whole lot of it in the ergonomics and human factors realm. So that's something I'd really like to do is to reach out to labor unions and at least inform them of what's going on. And a final thought. Standards work can involve just as much diplomacy as it does science, and that's very, very true. Being diplomatic and bringing everybody to the table and working out conflicts and developing a good usable standard involves a lot of diplomacy, a lot of listening. Now I've got some links to information here in the presentation. When you get a copy of it, you can take a look at whatever you'd like to. And I'd like to thank you very much for attending this webinar. And I sincerely hope that you got something, out of it. I've got my contact information there. And I think now we've got about 15 minutes or so for Q&A.
Bob, pretty incredible. I'd like to thank you for that presentation, your ability to delineate this detail of information on standards and related committees and make it understandable and orderly is
Thank you.
absolutely commendable. Maybe you're going to be called the standards amplifier. New nickname for you. I'm seeing some things in the chat already about how informative of it is. I'd like to start off with a very basic question, Bob, while we're waiting for some people to put things in the chat. If somebody wants to get involved in a committee, in any of these standards committees, and there's so many of them, where
Yes.
does one start? How do you
Yeah,
start?
yeah, I would say that first, if someone is interested in standards, now generally they will have an idea of what standard or what standards body they might want to be involved in. For example, if it's SAE. In the case of the ISO standards, like the TC 159, I would recommend that that person first go to the website of the Human Factors and Ergonomics Society and take a look at publications and take a look at ISO standards. There will be like a one-page summary for each of the different subcommittees on that. So they can take a look at who's involved, who they can contact, generally the tag chair, and what standards are in process or have already been produced. Now, I think in Canada, probably to go to the CSA group website and take a look at the standards there and who the contact folks are.
Thank you, Bob. So interesting and very relevant question. Some of these standards take a long time to be developed. Is there a risk that by the time it's developed, it's out of date?
It's out of date. Yeah, that is a risk, and these really represent a trade-off. Now, what I had mentioned about going back to 2018 and that letter that was written, and what we changed, where we had more stakeholder involvement, we had more transparency, we presented on standards projects at conferences, we did extreme literature reviews, that takes time. So there's a trade-off between that and getting a standard out very, very quickly. I think in some cases, if there's a need, a standard can be produced fairly quickly. But I'd say in general, with the standards that I've been involved in, you figure about a minimum of 2 years. And it's up to the standards makers to make sure that what is in that standard is not out of date by the time that it is published. And also going back to the other thing is the revision of the standard. Most standards are going to be reviewed or should be reviewed at least every 5 years. Now, in the case of some of this ISO 11228 Part 3 on the upper extremity repetitive motion, we've kind of decided once the standard is published, we're going to review it every 2 years to make sure that it includes the most up-to-date information. But that's a hard question. That's a hard question.
Bob, exoskeleton guidance is urgently needed. Is there anything you can recommend in the meantime?
Oh,
It's a loaded question.
yeah, that is very much, and I agree. Exoskeletons now for a number of years. In the about 4 years before I retired at GM, we started to do a lot of work on exoskeletons with testing. We had some great people. And of course there were things that kind of interfered with plant changes and COVID and all of that delayed everything. My impression is that the ASTM standards that are out there are probably the first place that I would look for guidance on exoskeletons. Now, there are a number of exoskeleton standards out there that ASTM has produced, that the committee 48.02 and 03. on aspects related to sizing and fitting, et cetera, et cetera. And also any exoskeleton company that I might deal with, I'd ask them, are you aware of the ASTM standards, or are there other standards like some of the ones in Europe that you're using? You know, what is the basis for what you've done? But yes, that is it's a very topical question and a very loaded one.
Thank you, Bob. Great advice. Do you have any examples of regulations or regulators adopting any of the HFES standards you mentioned?
Of the HFES standards and ISO standards now, in the case of ISO standards, Brazil, for example, adopted the 11228 parts 1, 2, and 3 series as a regulation, and that was what spurred that 2018 letter. Now, in talking about the ANSI HFES standards, the HFES, ANSI HFES 400 on the HRLs, I believe that is being adopted. I don't think necessarily as a regulation, but as a guideline in certain industries. And I'm not sure if that may actually end up becoming a regulation in the DoD. I'd have to look into that, but I know that there's been discussion of that.
Okay. And one of our participants has put a note in that the UK MOD has recently completed its second 3D full body anthropometry survey in 2006, and they managed just under 3,000 people, and most of the 200 measures were from the scanner, but some
Yeah.
still had to be manual.
Yes, that is usually the case. Also, I think some manual measurements are taken to validate the scanning as well. There have been a number of countries that have done large anthropometric studies. I know Korea, China, some of the countries in Europe as well. Some of those data are proprietary, but the idea being that, you know, adults and children and older people, etc., are have been scanned. So the data may or may not be widely available, and again, if it's proprietary, then you have to pay for access to it. And that was kind of the goal of the ISO 7250 series, was to have a number of different usable anthropometric measurements, and to be able to have a technical report that then, you know, has all of the different national data in it, and then to be able to define like design ranges for different parts of the world.
There is an additional comment from the same participant related to size. With larger people, they find problems finding bony landmarks in some of the
Yes,
anthro work.
yes, I think that is definitely an issue. Now, I want to say that you know, if we look at the modern population in North America, and in Europe as well, we have steadily, you know, looking at secular trend, we haven't increased that much in size as far as things like height. That secular trend, depending upon the nation, began to kind of level out in the 60s or the 70s, you know, whatever. But we have gotten heavier. And there are any number of anthropometric surveys that have found that. For example, the ANSWER, the U.S. military anthropometric study, you know, found that compared to 1988, and I think it was 2014 or so, you know, the participants were significantly heavier, like by 26 pounds. And if we look at that upper end of the range of body weight, we've seen that has very much increased. And I think that there was a professor at the University of Michigan that said one time, and there was a session at HFES a number of years ago that I chaired on anthropometry, and she said, well, you need to take a look at what's going on in the tails. So yes, in many respects, we need to accommodate larger individuals, you know, in our designs. For example, seating on aircraft.
That was one of the comments.
There's a policy statement back, I think about 2016 or 2017, that's posted on the HFES website that talks about issues with coach airline seating. And I actually led that. We had a number of people participate in that, anthropometrists, et cetera, and that showed that, well, airline seats disaccommodate, the majority of the population. And the size that they had used was essentially what the population looked like in 1963. And I think the male was about 5'9" or 5'10" and weighed 169 pounds, and the female was 5'4" and weighed 118 pounds. And we're different than that. We're much more diverse, and we're much heavier in many respects. So that is a real challenge to accommodate, those tails of the distribution, the very small and the very large. And I think we've kind of shifted, towards increased body weight and increased body dimensions, even though we're not necessarily taller.
Thanks for that, Bob. Can you say something about how these standards get integrated into accreditation bodies? Do you have
Oh,
interface with any of them?
I haven't.
Okay.
Um, there is, I know, an ISO, the ISO management standards, like the ISO 9000 and all, which I've never had too much involvement in,
Okay.
where they may cite standards. Okay, in order to be accredited, you have to use these particular standards. So an
Okay.
accreditation body, and that's another potential application of a standard, may adapt a standard for for use in that way. Although I'm not particularly familiar with
Okay.
that. I haven't been involved in too much of that.
Okay.
But very
Are
good question.
are there any feedback mechanisms in the ISO process from countries or industries that have implemented the standard that would benefit the revision process or update of that particular standard?
Yeah, that is a very, very good question. Feedback right now, I personally feel that the feedback mechanism is not that great. The feedback that we have received is generally, if someone has an issue, they have to look into whoever their national body is, like they're using a particular standard and they have some suggestions for it, or something is not right, and they need to feed that back. They need to do essentially research and feedback to their national committee, whoever their tag in their particular country is, and say, hey, I've got an issue, a problem, or a suggestion on such and such and such standard. Now, in the case of the HFES ISO standards, they can contact the tag chair. They can look up on the HFES website. They can contact the tag chair and give that feedback directly to them. But that's, I think, something I'm going to look a little bit more into is feedback.
Okay, we don't want to make more work for you, Bob. Your bio suggests that you are definitely a standards amplifier. I think we'll close off with this from my colleague, Steve Fisher. First of all, thanks for a wonderful talk. And you did highlight this a bit, Bob. How can we help? Can you share one or two ways we can all get involved to support standards and the development of them and their use?
Yeah, I'd say get involved with with whatever standards you're interested in. Contact me, contact the tag chair, whatever. One of the things that I pushed is someone who maybe wants to become interested involved in standards, but they're not sure. We can add them to our distribution list, so they get, and also the opportunity to come to the yearly tag meetings, and they can be an observer. And they can offer opinions, or they can join the tag and become an actual participant, on the tag. So there are avenues out there, and that's something that please feel free to contact me about.
Okay. And Bob, in closing, we've had somebody here who's currently based in the Philippines, indicating from what my senior colleagues have shared, ANSI and BIS FMA standards are widely recognized, while ISO standards are just beginning to gain traction in the office furniture space. And they'd love to hear your thoughts on any insights you might have on that.
Okay, on
The office furniture
office
space.
furniture. Now, I know there are some ANSI standards. There's one by BIFMA. Now, that's the Business and Institutional Furniture Manufacturers Association, another acronym, sorry. And they have published a standard on furniture design. Now, the HFES standard looks at both furniture design and also the computer equipment itself. And I know that there was some disagreement between BIFMA and HFES, the HFES 100 committee, on certain aspects. And I think there's some issues about anthropometric accommodation and a few other things, you know, with that. But there's the BIFMA standard out there. I'm not real familiar with it. I think if someone were to Google BIFMA, BIFMA, and ANSI, there is that BIFMA ANSI standard out there on furniture design.
Thank you so much, Bob. I want to thank also Zuzu, our co-host from the IEA Technical Committee on MSD. This has just been a wonderful presentation of dearth of information that was presented in such a manageable way. And I believe it will serve as a reference guide for years and years to come for people to understand standards and, you know, what they are and where they are. So thank you so much, Bob. And if we do have any additional questions that didn't get answered today, we will advise people to send them to Bettina or myself, and then we'll connect with you on those.
Okay, thank you very much. And Catherine, I'd like to thank you. I'd like to thank Ju. I'd like to thank Bettina, who tolerated all my updates to my slides. And I especially also want to thank Dr. Steve Fisher.
Okay, our pleasure, Bob. Thank you so much and have a wonderful rest of the day, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, again.